Lewis books in this series are two nonfiction works, The Abolition of Man and The Discarded Image. The fiction books that are commonly referred to as the Space Trilogy, but I have struck the word space out and wrote Ransom's Trilogy instead. After Humanity and Deeper Heaven, books by other authors that can provide some illumination for those Lewis works. Again, After Humanity is sort of a commentary on the abolition of man, and Deeper Heaven is a it kind of uses the discarded image to illuminate the space trilogy, which is one of the things we'll be probably spending most of our time on today, using the ideas in the discarded image to illuminate the space trilogy. But before we do that, can anybody remind us of the, let's call them the three, we called them the three proclivities of Lewis. Three things that he kind of was interested in his life that okay, I see multiple hands, so we'll go left to right. What was one? Myth, yeah. And Sharon? And Annalise? Morality, that's correct. Myth, morality, not man-king, mankind. I did the circle and my hand just finished on its own. Myth, morality, and mankind. Three key themes in the abolition of man. Anybody remember those? Okay. One was morality exists, moral truth exists, and it matters. The second was true human flourishing requires the cultivation of healthy moral sentiments. And the third is that rejecting these ideas leads to worship of and ultimately domination by nature. So we'll probably spend a little bit more time next week on those, but I did want to make sure I mention them every week because, as we said last week, while we may be talking about 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 books, there's actually one book that's sort of the center of the philosophical moral message, and the others sort of, reflect that or amplify that. Yeah.
So, when you said that, I'm finding it leading to Romans chapter 1. Is that a nice way to look at that last one, that you reject you get Romans chapter 1, which is
I think that's an example of it. Yeah, I don't know that that's exactly what Lewis is focused on, although partly, right? I mean, I think I would say that third theme, rejecting these ideas leads to worship of and ultimately domination by nature, is the summary statement of his third essay, which shares its title with The Abolition of Man. And so I do think that especially the worship element is there in Romans 1. The domination is as well. He's going a bit further and for maybe different reasons than Paul is in Romans 1. But it's definitely, it's observing some of the effects of the same sin, the same error, right? So let's talk about proclivity number 1, myth and true myth. The way we most commonly use the word myth today is to simply mean something people believe that isn't true. So from shows like Mythbusters to clickbait articles on 7 myths about this or that, we use that term almost entirely in this way. A myth is an untruth, a false belief, right? That's the common vernacular use of it today. But having that definition in our head is likely to be an impediment to understanding what Tolkien meant when he described Lewis's effort in writing Out of the Silent Planet to be exploring myth, or understanding what Lewis means when he calls the gospel true myth. In order to understand Lewis's fascination with myth, let's talk about one or two other ways the word is used, both in general and in Lewis's writing. So the most basic and probably most historically common way that the word myth is used is a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of a people or explaining a natural or social phenomenon, and typically involving supernatural beings or events. I'll read that again. This is the definition from the Oxford English Dictionary. A traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of a people or explaining a natural or social phenomenon, and typically involving supernatural beings or events. Now, this is a perfectly serviceable definition, concise and helpful, and it can absolutely be applied to well-developed mythologies like those of the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, or even simple folk tales like Aesop's fables. And this definition is also very well applicable to Out of the Silent Planet and the other books in the Ransom Trilogy. All three books discuss and dramatize the origins and history of people on three planets in our solar system. And I'll repeat these later when I'm talking about the actual cosmology. But the first one is Thulkandra, which is Earth. And Thulkandra means the silent planet. So the book Out of the Silent Planet is referring to them leaving Earth, Thulkandra, to go to the next planet, Malacandra, or Mars. That's the planet that Ransom and his co-travelers visit in that first novel. And then Paralandra, or Venus, is where Ransom is sent in the second book of the trilogy. And what we get in all three of these books is reflections and information about the origins of each of these planets, about explaining as it said, the natural or social phenomenon, and certainly involving supernatural beings and events, right? All three books delve into these things. So the OED definition of myth is definitely appropriately applied to the Ransom Trilogy, and it seems likely this definition is what Tolkien had in mind when he said Lewis was exploring myth when he set about starting to write the trilogy. That said, to more fully understand the medieval model, how it applies to the trilogy, and also how Lewis's idea of true myth comes in, we should probably explore just a little bit further. One of the books I was reading, I can't remember, I think it was an essay by Alistair McGrath, actually, talked about how Lewis's attraction to myth was in part because, as he put it, it evokes the sense of the numinous. Evokes the sense of the numinous. I'll spell that. I misspelled it. I misspelled that. I spelled it based on the root word. Numen is a Latin term for divinity, divine presence, or divine will. And it's got a bigger semantic space than that, but those are kind of key key elements to what noumen means. So that which is numinous is that which inspires a sense of divine presence or awe or the sublime or other spiritual elevation. The idea here is that myth is not just a nice story or an exciting story or a well-developed, complex story with lots of world building. It is something that inclines our spirit to dwell on the divine. The supernatural element of traditional myth, lost my place in the readings. The supernatural element of traditional myth is not there merely to drive the story forward or to allow the inclusion of fantastical elements. It is both an expression of man's groping for the ultimate and transcendent, and an invitation for the hearer to do the same. So, one of the reasons that Lewis called the gospel true myth is that the biblical accounts of Christ and his life have all the hallmarks of traditional myth, and they actually happened in history for reals. Right? It should be no surprise to us that God, the greatest of authors, would weave a compelling story in human history, presenting it to his children in a way that is both familiar and comprehensible. We could talk, if we want to, about Old Testament stories and the way that they contrasted with and skewered or inverted the pagan equivalents, right? They were familiar to the audience even as they were imparting new information because of the way in which they were conveyed. These are ways in which God condescends to his people, or as Calvin put it, he lisps to us like young children. Right? In order for them to understand in their tiny way his great and eternal mysteries. So whereas man's myths present an ultimately inaccurate and or incomplete picture due to a combination of sin, absent and or misinterpreted revelation. For example, the Greeks did not have access to what God had at the time revealed only to the Hebrews. And our finite natures. God's true myth tells the true and complete story of his Son emptying himself, taking on flesh, and intervening on our behalf to pay the penalty for our sin and reconcile us to our Creator. It was an interesting White Horse Inn episode not too long ago. I think it's been in the last month. They've been talking about contemporary popular speakers and teachers and that Christians are sometimes fascinating with. And this particular episode, they were talking about Jordan Peterson, right? And the thing they were talking about with Jordan Peterson is Jordan Peterson's a person that likes to quote the Bible a lot, and he likes to refer to Bible stories a lot. But he is very slippery when you try to pin him down about the truth of what happened. And the thing that got the White Horse Inn guys going was an interview that Peterson did with, I believe it was actually a skeptical podcaster or something like that. And this person tried to pin Peterson down on, okay, so let's say you were there on Easter Sunday, AD 33, in the, where the grave is. Does Jesus walk out of the grave or not, right? This is the most important question you can ask, and it's obvious to a person who doesn't believe it, right? And Peterson's answer was kind of but even if it were, I wouldn't know what it meant, right? It's like, well, for somebody who knows a lot of Bible, you sure don't seem to know 1 Corinthians 15, because we know exactly what it meant, right? We know what it meant if you read just a few, chapters on in the Gospels after it, right? The import of that event is not just some, Jungian archetypal figure or idea, right? It is something that actually happened, and the fact that it actually happened is critical to our history, to our religion, to our hope, right? All of these things. I can keep rambling, but I'm going to stop and ask for questions or comments about myth before we talk about the medieval model. Yeah, Tim.
I think what you just said, though, with Peterson also plays into Lewis's struggle before he became a Christian.
Oh, yeah.
He had a struggle with the biblical narrative, trying to decode it, if you will. And I think with Tolkien understanding and aiding him, letting him know just read it and let the narrative be what it is.
No, that's exactly correct. Lewis's love for myth was an avenue by which God brought him to faith, because his conversations with Tolkien and other Inklings helped him understand that there's something really important about the fact that this myth actually happened in history. And there's an essay in God in the Dock. I think it's called True Myth, or On True Myth, and snooty way of calling it True Myth, that talks about exactly this thing, right? That and this thematically is super present in the Space Trilogy, right? They talk about, and you see them start talking about it in Paralandra the most, right? This understanding that the Paralandrans had of what happened on Earth many thousands of years ago, and the import of the incarnation in rescuing and redeeming Earth, right? The humans of Earth are rescued by the incarnation, and that event, the fact that they were that humans, that the Thulkandrans were redeemed by the incarnation, actually became a blessing for the rational, believing beings on the other planets too, right? Which I thought was a really cool part of what he is exploring in these origin stories. Yes.
That reminds me. I think it's the end of Out of the Silent Planet when he's speaking to Melisandre.
Uh-huh.
I think Melisandre says something like, "These things we have long desired to look into."
Yeah, which is a clear illusion.
Clear illusion.
Yeah.
And so here's an angel saying, "These things we have long desired to look into."
Yes.
I think as we were talking about this whole myth thing, I think a good way to summarize Ransom is to say that it is an articulation of the verse, "The heavens declare the glory of God."
Right. Yeah.
I
Yes.
think what's also important is when you think about Lewis's journey,
Mm-hmm.
and I think the thing that really set him off. Remember, he grew up in an Anglican
Yeah.
household, but hearing that all other religions are completely untrue
Right.
and only Christianity is true.
Right.
And I think him going back as a Christian and saying, no, there's some truth there. Let's draw it out and see what it is.
Yeah. There's a concept in Out of the Silent Planet, and it's talking specifically about sin, right? Where it uses the adjective bent, right? And they refer to Satan as the bent one. And one of the things that I really like about that is as one of my deacons some time ago said, that Satan is not a creator, he is a pervert, right? And all sin is a bending, warping, inverting, turning inside out of some kind of blessing or true thing, right? Some more bent than others, right? And when we look at mythology, right, if we look at the mythologies of the Greeks or the Romans, or any other mythology, especially from antiquity, what you see is groping with error, right? And the fact that they were groping with error seems really present when Paul is on Mars Hill, right? When he is standing in front of the tomb or the temple to the unknown God, right? This was something that Greek philosophers were like, we know that this picture we have of Olympus and Zeus and all of these things, we know we're not exactly getting it. We know we're reaching for something that's more than that, right? But on account of their ignorance and account of their blindness, Romans 1, they could not grasp that thing, right? We, all who have lived since the incarnation, live in light of that amazing event, right, that took place, and we are now able, with the aid and compelling of the Holy Spirit, to actually understand that and put faith in it, right? But this is something that was very present in the mythology. Yeah. Right, yeah, yeah.
And obviously that's silly. And we hear some people make the argument about, well, how do you teach Christians?
Yeah.
And my friend responds to that by saying, shut up and we'll baptize Toyota-san. But the point is, like, what happens when Christians get a hold of myth is we are like, oh, that's just a little piece of the true myth that points back.
Well, yeah, and something I'll talk about when we get to the medieval model a little bit is just the way that we like press our contemporary categories and way of thinking on earlier peoples as if they were idiots, right? Yeah, I actually have that written down. That's point number one in the next section. But the distorted image does a really, really good job of explaining how the medieval model takes all of these sources from before, right, and brings them into their understanding of reality, with Christianity illuminating all those things, shining its light on what's actually going on there. So with that, let's move there to discussion of the medieval model, and that does start with this idea of chronological snobbery as an obstacle to understanding. We tend to look at the past through glasses colored by the present, and this can prove to be a weakness in two important ways. The first, there's an implicit assumption that we are smarter, wiser, and better educated than our predecessors. The corollary is that, whether we say it out loud or not, that earlier minds were dumber, more foolish, and more ignorant than we are now. Footnote, there's a long discussion about Hegel's dialectic and the myth of progress and why that's affected our chronological snobbery, but we're not going to have that discussion today, but maybe afterwards. So, implicit assumption that we are smarter, wiser, and better educated, therefore they are dumber, more foolish, and more ignorant. The second is we tend to apply contemporary categories and ways of looking at times and people that did not think or live that way. And I tried to think of kind of a simple example of this, And from our own theological tradition, one might muse, was St. Augustine a postmillennialist or an amillennialist? Right? And in fact, this is a ridiculous question. And one of the reasons it's a ridiculous question is those labels and their underlying categories are built on more than 1,000 years of theological development after Augustine. That does not make him an ignorant rube. He was, to use my earlier phrase, smarter, wiser, and better educated than anyone in this room and probably most of the people we'll ever meet in our lives, right? So I hope that gives you like a little nugget of what that chronological snobbery looks like when we apply it inappropriately to the past. Yes, Tim? Right, exactly, yeah. Was he a Presbyterian? It's easier to say no to that, but it's still a dumb question. yeah, because, no, but wrong question, wrong categories, wrong way of looking at it, and he would ask questions of us that we would have no idea how to answer to, because we have lost a lot of his categories. You were starting to say?
I was just going to say we see chronological snobbery everywhere in any discussion of history, down to like conspiracy theories that
Yeah.
Egyptians couldn't possibly build the pyramid, it has to have been aliens.
Yeah. Yeah.
We see chronological snobbery in things like conspiracy theories where people look at the Egyptians building the pyramids and say that they couldn't possibly have done that because it has to have been aliens.
And we know, having read the Ransom trilogy, that it was El Delia that built the pyramid.
It's just like reading Charles Dickens. Like he's
Yeah.
writing to like the late people of his day.
Yeah, well, and a lot of yes, no, that, yeah, no, that's for sure, yeah. Yeah, yes, yeah. Yeah, looking at our interlocutor. So another thing that is not, I mean, it is time bound. Another thing place where chronological snobbery or these fallacies of implicit assumption and misaligned categories, I think of it in the way that we try to have a conversation with or about Eastern Orthodoxy, right? They do not use anything like the same categories we do in the West because the Reformation was an argument between Western Christians, right? So when you say, does an Eastern Orthodox person believe in salvation by faith alone? You're not answering a question they can answer. And you have to say, what is this compact label that we use in the West to differentiate ourselves from the Roman tradition and to identify the point of friction between us and Rome, right? What is the essential problem and where's the essential deviation from the authority, which is Scripture itself, right? You can't have a productive conversation with or about Eastern Orthodoxy until you, A, realize there's a problem of communication and categories, and B, seek to overcome it by finding the commonalities and find where there's a point of friction there. Because you will find it, but you may not be using, none of you, the same words to describe the problem.
I'm wondering though, Rob, C.S. Lewis was really, I liked his admonitions, particularly to the clergy, taking what you know and breaking it down for the vernacular, particularly of the
Yeah.
There's a little bit of that here in terms of let's make sure we're saying the same thing about the thing we're talking about, in particular, if you will, as well.
Yeah, no, and wow, there's a long sidebar I can do on that, and I'm not gonna, because I'm looking up at the clock. I'm looking up at the clock productively versus last week where the clock was saying something that was not correlating to reality at all. I don't know what it was saying. Just get off, it was saying. Stop talking and go home. Okay, so let's, so when we look at the medieval model, we must be careful not to dismiss these earlier generations as idiots who couldn't tell that the universe didn't revolve around the earth, nor to impose other modern categories and viewpoints on their thought. And I'll give you some specific examples as we work through the medieval model. In the discarded image, Lewis tries to explain the way medievals learned and how they tended to synthesize that learning. I'm actually going to read a lot of quotes from the discarded image because he says it so well and so concisely that my summaries are not near as good as Lewis just speaking for himself. So I'm going to say some of these things and we'll talk about them. One of the aspects of medieval thought was the way they learned. They didn't learn either by pre-logical, as he calls it, habit and ritual, nor by more modern observation and scientism. They learned primarily through the written word. And Lewis says this. This is one of the things that differentiate the period almost equally from savagery and our modern civilization. In a savage community, you absorb your culture in part unconsciously from participation in the immemorial pattern of behavior and in part by word of mouth from the old men of the tribe. In our own society, most knowledge depends, in the last resort, on observation, but the Middle Ages depended predominantly on books. Though literacy was, of course, far rarer than it is now, reading was in one way, a more important ingredient in the total culture. So he then goes on to point out that given the diversity of written sources available and the cultural differences of each, the medieval scholars were very interested in building systems to reconcile contradictions and incompatibilities. We see examples of this in Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, right? We see it in Dante's Divine Comedy. The medieval cosmology is another example, trying to reconcile the work of astronomers, poets, philosophers, and others from different ages, societies, and backgrounds. So the medieval cosmology was very heavily influenced by Aristotle, who lived and worked in the 4th century before Christ. Aristotle himself was influenced by other philosophers and scientists from the 4th through 6th centuries BC. And in fact, I didn't write the guy's name down, but one of the key developers of the kind of cosmology that I'm going to draw very poorly on the board was one of his fellow students of Plato. Name started with an E, I didn't write it down. I'm going to flip a couple things here. In Aristotle, Earth is, and in medieval cosmology in general, Earth is not so much at the center as it is at the bottom. So, let me start drawing, and then I'm going to read a couple of quotes here. So, one of the things when we talk about categories that we project onto older thought is when we hear they had a geocentric model of the universe, right? All we think about is Earth is at the middle. But what we do is we place Earth at the middle of our cosmological idea, right? Earth is a tiny ball, there's a huge amount of space, and there's the moon, and it's in orbit around the Earth, and then the sun is in orbit around the Earth, and then the other planets. But we've already gone off from what they actually thought, okay? And that is what they saw were not orbital rings that balls were rotating around. What they saw in their mental image and in their cosmological image were spheres, spheres of authority, full-orbed spheres encasing one another, right? And so you have Earth, and then you have the sphere of the moon, and then you have, I want to make sure, Mercury, Venus. Oh, here's the sun. Solus, I think they, yeah. Then Mars, then Jupiter, then Saturn, and then the asteroids, but this is really, really important, okay? When you think about medieval cosmology, make sure you think about this. At the end, in like the 10th ring, is God and heaven and the angels, okay? Meaning, unlike our conception of an infinite universe that goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on until somewhere out there there's nothing, right? The big thing, the true thing, the thing in which all things are contained is God in the heavens, right? And all that is within it, right? And that's where we get to this idea of the earth is not at the center as if we are the most important thing. We're at the bottom because we're the least important thing. Because where is hell in the medieval cosmology? It's in here, right? It's under the earth, right? Dante goes down into the Inferno before he goes up into the Empyrean. Yeah, it looked like you were, oh, okay. So this is an important thing. The spirit of this, I loved the way he put this, if I can find the right two-page sequence here. Okay. The spirit of this scheme, though not every detail, is strongly present in the medieval model, and if the reader will suspend his disbelief and exercise his imagination upon it, even for a few minutes, I think he'll be aware of the vast readjustment involved in a perceptive reading of the old poets. He will find his whole attitude to the universe inverted. In modern, that is evolutionary thought, man stands at the top of a stair whose foot is lost in obscurity. In this, in the medieval model, he stands at the bottom of a stair whose top is invisible with light. I love that language that Lewis uses there. What a great, I love a good metaphor. Lewis knew how to write a good metaphor. That was good stuff. Yes, it is from the discarded image. Most of the quotes that I'll read today are from the discarded image. So, yeah, I mean, it's so I was going through this afternoon and kind of tuning and cutting and all of this stuff, and I was looking in all my Kindle notes of all the things I highlighted in the discarded image, and I'm like, well, we could just spend the next 3 weeks just reading quotes from the discarded image. We're not going to, but let that be an encouragement to you to read it, because for every cool thing that I quote here, there's 10 cool things that I had to leave out for time. Yeah.
Does this at all tie to reality?
It does, that's primarily moral, and while morality is in the medieval model, and I think you could find points of contact there, the main points that Lewis is trying to make are not necessarily those. It's more transcendent than that. So one of the things that is another important aspect of the medieval model is there's a really important line of delineation in the medieval model. And that is between the sphere of the moon and everything past it. Okay, and this comes straight from Aristotle. Aristotle being and again, Aristotle's writing 400 BC. Aristotle, being interested both in biology and in astronomy, found himself faced with an obvious contrast. I'm quoting Lewis again. The characteristic of the world we men inhabit is incessant change by birth, growth, procreation, death, and decay. And within that world, such experimental methods as had been achieved in his time could discover only an imperfect uniformity in Aristotle's world, and indeed today, although we are less humble before the limits of science today than he was. Things happened in the same way, not perfectly, nor invariably, but on the whole and for the most part. But the world studied by astronomy seemed quite different. No nova had yet been observed in Aristotle's time. So as far as he could find out, the celestial bodies were permanent. They neither came into existence nor passed away. So that's a huge part of the category shift and the perception shift. Because when they're drawing conclusions about ultimate reality, when they're drawing conclusions about God, about angels, about spiritual things, right? The permanence of everything above, right? These kind of constantly, there's a hymn, and I forgot to look up which one it is, but there's a hymn where the phrase "the rolling spheres" is in the lyric of the hymn, and it's not referring to our cosmology. If Bradley were here, he'd know. Maybe. But the point is, and now we're all gone. We were all gone from the discussion. But that idea of rolling spheres is much more medieval. You've got these permanent spheres, kind of that have always been, that don't change, and the reason we perceive differences from our perspective is really because of our change, because of our movement and our mutability, right? I'm going to read you a couple of additional sort of cool quotes, if you will, about these things. And I was going to start drawing out the cosmology of the Ransom books, but I'll probably wait for next week for that. Yeah. Okay. Could you read like the whole line there, just so that we're all. Yeah. So, okay. Now that whole line, right? It like oozes with a medieval perception of ultimate reality, right? He's a king
Yes.
of everything. He's the potentate of time, creator of the rolling spheres, right? And this is a big deal. And I should stop here because I didn't do the disclaimer early on to say Lewis is not arguing for the factual truth of a geocentric model.
Right.
Okay? He is explaining how the medieval world looked at these things, and then he is talking about ultimately what we've lost when we threw the baby out with the bathwater, right? That's and he talks about the difference between the Copernican revolution and the Galilean revolution, right? Because Copernicus was really not questioning necessarily the whole spheres. It was just like observation says the sun's got to be in the middle, right? So Copernicus is taking things and he is aligning them with reality, but he's not questioning the model. He's questioning the details, right? But Galileo, in concert with other thinkers at the time, was posing a challenge to the whole model, to everything that was tied up in it. And so what we lose when we lose the medieval model unthoughtfully, or when you've already started eating away at the ground underneath it, at the foundations of it through scientism and Enlightenment thought and all of these things, and then you disprove this anchor idea, right, of what's the middle, right? All of a sudden it just kind of crumbles. And the problem is not that we didn't pose a big enough fight about what's in the middle. The problem is we just surrendered at the foundational level before we ever got there. Yeah.
I think part of it too is like and you see this a lot, especially in THS, but even in Out of the Silent Planet, like Ransom is unlearning.
Yeah.
He has that whole, as he's traveling through the cosmos, he realizes that the word space is silly.
Yeah, I'm going to read that here.
Yeah, it's so good. And there's this idea, I think, in our modern culture, and he really articulates it well in that Theory of Strength, of like, in a way, we are more geocentric than, you know what I mean? Because we think that we are the pinnacle of,
Yes,
because we have facts and science, and we can tell you
Yeah,
what is
we say we're not geocentric, but we are anthropocentric.
Yeah, 100%.
Man is the measure of all things.
Right, and I'm thinking of when he says, different C.S. Lewis, but even in your world, that is only what a star is made of, but not what it is.
Not what it is, yes, that's right.
We think we know everything, really we know that.
So I'm going to read a couple more things that are related to the medieval model, and then we'll turn off the microphone and stay and talk for another 2 hours. But we'll talk about, we'll start applying these ideas to the Ransom Trilogy next week. So we're going to really center on these books next week, and then the final week we'll come back to the Abolition of Man and talk through those 3 central ideas of the Abolition of Man, and relate them back to some of the things that we saw in the Space Trilogy. So a few more quotes from The Discarded Image. I love this discussion when he's talking about the way the medievals used language, and a lot of this was medieval poets using language of influence, and kindly inclining is a phrase that they use, right? This is inclined to this. Yeah, did you have a question? Okay, sorry, I thought you were gesturing for a quote. Versus the way that we talk about him in our modern, we know better, we're not ignorant rubes way, right? So the question at once, this is Lewis, the question at once arises whether medieval thinkers really believed that what we now call inanimate objects were sentient and purposive, because they use that kind of language in their poetry, like almost like Rock's thought, or like this is inclined to do that even if it's inanimate, right? The answer in general is undoubtedly no. I say in general because they attributed life and even intelligence to one privileged class of objects, the stars, which we hold to be inorganic. And I'll try to come back to that next week because it's kind of an important thing in the ransom mythology. The stars and the idea of them being a little different than other inanimate objects, right? Lewis says, but full-blown panpsychism, the doctrine of universal sentience, was not, to the best of my knowledge, held by anyone before Campanella, 17th century, and never made many converts. On the common medieval view, there were 4 grades of terrestrial reality: mere existence, as in stones; existence with growth, as in vegetables; existence and growth with sensation, as in beasts; and existence, and all these things with reason, as in men. Stones, by definition, could not literally strive or desire. If we could ask the medieval scientist, why then do you talk as if they did? He might, for he was always a dialectician, retort with the counter question, do you intend your language about laws and obedience any more literally than I intend mine about kindly inclining? Because we talk about nature follows nature's laws, right? Nature must obey nature's laws. The atoms and their elements spin around each other according to the laws of gravity and the laws of physics. Do you intend your language about laws and obedience any more literally than I intend mine about kindly inclining? Do you really believe that a falling stone is aware of a directive issued to it by some legislator and feels either a moral or a prudential obligation to conform? We should then have to admit that both ways of expressing the facts are metaphorical. The odd thing is that ours is the more anthropomorphic of the two. To talk as if inanimate bodies had a homing instinct is to bring them no nearer to us than pigeons. To talk as if they could obey laws is to treat them like men and even like citizens. But though neither statement can be taken literally, it does not follow that it makes no difference what is used. On the imaginative and emotional level, it makes a great difference whether with the medievals we project upon the universe our strivings and desires, or with the moderns our police system and our traffic regulations. I love that. Lewis could also make a sharp point in a very subtle and smooth way. Okay, I'm going to read 2 more. And we'll be done. I'm sorry we're going long. These facts are in themselves curiosities of mediocre interest. They become valuable only insofar as they enable us to, and he's talking about the way they look at the heavens, the way we look at the stars or whatever. He says, they become valuable only insofar as they enable us to enter more fully into the consciousness of our ancestors by realizing how such a universe must have affected those who believed it. The recipe for such realization is not in the study of books. You must go out on a starry night and walk about for half an hour trying to see the sky in terms of the old cosmology. Remember that you now have an absolute up or down. The earth is really the center, really the lowest place. Movement to it from whatever direction is downward movement. As a modern, you located the stars at a great distance. For distance, you must now substitute that very special and far less abstract sort of distance, which we call height. height, which speaks immediately to our muscles and our nerves. The medieval model is vertiginous. There's a vocabulary word. And the fact that the height of the stars in the medieval astronomy is very small compared to their distance in the modern will not turn out to have the kind of importance you anticipated. For thought and imagination, 10 million miles and 1,000 million are much the same. Both can be conceived, that is, we can do sums with both, and neither can be imagined. And the more imagination we have, the better we shall know this. The really important difference is that in the medieval universe, while unimaginably large, it was also unambiguously finite. And one unexpected result of this is to make the smallness of the Earth more vividly felt. In our universe, she is small, no doubt, but so are the galaxies, so is everything, and so what? But in theirs, there was an absolute standard of comparison. The furthest sphere, Dante's Maggior Corpo, is quite simply and finally the largest object in existence. The word small as applied to Earth thus takes on a far more absolute significance. Again, because the medieval universe is finite, it has a shape, the perfect spherical shape, containing within it an ordered variety. Hence, to look out in the night sky with modern eyes is like looking out over a sea that fades away into mist, or looking about one in a trackless forest, trees forever and no horizon. Imagine those things, right? Isn't that a vivid image? You've been to the ocean at night? When you look out, there's just nothing. It's actually to look up at the towering medieval universe is much more like looking at a great building. The space of modern astronomy may arouse terror or bewilderment or vague reverie. The spheres of the old present us with an object in which the mind can rest, overwhelming in its greatness and satisfying in its harmony. That is the sense in which our universe is romantic and theirs was classical. So what I immediately thought of when I read this paragraph is, I've mentioned before, I have a buddy who lives out in the desert. And what he gets to see at night is absolutely shaped by this thing, right? Those of us that live in the city and very rarely get out into the woods, we mostly think, we don't see this thing. And when we think about big, when we think about the immensity of the universe in very modern terms, it's a little bit like stomach turning, right, as Lewis kind of points out. That the more you fathom the immensity of it and the infinitude of it, the more queasy and unsettled you become, right? But Lewis is saying the exact opposite here, right? The medieval model says, I can rest in the completeness of God's creation, right? God is he in whom we live and move and have our being, right? Yeah.
This is a little bit of a side thing, but I've talked to some flat earthers,
Mm-hmm.
and part of the flat earth worldview is that they want a meaningful paradigm
Yeah.
for their place in the universe,
Yeah.
and they feel that the idea of the universe being billions of light years
Across, yeah.
across is condescending to the, or like, it doesn't, it makes God far, makes us inordinately small, and I think that I can like understand that feeling of just being like lost in a, like, where's our significance in that model, but.
No, they're not wrong about the problem.
Right, What I think
Yeah.
this book, this series actually addresses is that, like, the fact that God became man on our exiled little planet
Yeah,
gives us all the significance that we need. We don't
yeah,
necessarily need a geographically,
right.
like the proximity of the planets is not where we find the significance.
Right.
It's in what God chose to do on our small exiled planet.
Right. Yeah, and that's one of the ways that Lewis calls looking for the phrase he uses. On an imaginative and emotional level, right? Which is what the medieval model is speaking to, right? That this way that they were synthesizing all that they knew, right, was intended to preserve the truth, right? And, you know, the sort of instrumental differences were not the important thing, right? Or at least they were not foundational to the belief, right? And incidentally, for all of our sneering at them about believing the earth is the center, they didn't believe it was flat. Very, very, very few medievals believed the earth was flat. And they definitely didn't believe that there was like this big NASA conspiracy to hide the fact that the ice wall on the outside of all of that stuff.
The flat earth position too is interesting because I know someone that, and so it's like a dome.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what they say
It's like a
about
snow
the dome
globe.
is like, it's like God is so close. They say God feels so close
Yeah.
in this paradigm. And I just think that's an interesting thing to say.
Yeah.
I don't really.
Well, I mean, it's a thing that it captures a thing that we grope for,
Yeah.
right? But it is an explanation of the thing we're groping for that is flawed, right? That is in error. Let me read this one last paragraph, then we will formally conclude, and then we can keep talking, okay? So the one last paragraph I am going to read from the one thing I'm reading that's not from The Discarded Image. This is from Out of the Silent Planet, and I'll reread it next week. This is Ransom reflecting on space and the heavens as he's flying from Earth to Mars and looking out the window. He says, but Ransom, as time wore on, became aware of another and more spiritual cause for his progressive lightening and exaltation of heart. A nightmare long engendered in the modern mind by the mythology that follows in the wake of science was falling off him. He had read of space. At the back of his thinking for years had lurked the dismal fancy of the black, cold vacuity, the utter deadness which was supposed to separate the worlds. He had not known how much it affected him till now. Now that the very name space seemed a blasphemous libel for this empyrean ocean of radiance in which they swam. He could not call it dead. He felt life pouring into him from it every moment. How indeed should it be otherwise, since out of this oceans the world and all their life had come? He had thought it barren. He saw now that it was the womb of worlds, whose blazing and innumerable offspring looked down nightly even upon the earth with so many eyes, and here with how many more. No, space was the wrong name. Older thinkers had been wiser when they named it simply the heavens which declared the glory. Okay, and okay, so we are formally done. Now we can talk about whatever we want.